Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm Danny Rogers, the Editor-in-Chief of PRWeek, and today we're talking to the agency known as Golin, one of the UK's best-known PR consultancies who have had quite a year. I'm delighted to welcome Ondine Whittington, the President of Golin London, and Al Wood, the Chief Creative Officer at the agency. Hi guys.
Hi. Thanks for having us, Danny.
Good. So a big welcome to you. As I say, it's been quite a year for your agency, which is owned by Interpublic, of course, one of the biggest agencies in the UK. Golin London's Misheard version campaign for Specsavers picked up the very prestigious Grand Prix at the PR Lions in Cannes earlier this year, alongside a host of other Lions wins as well. Indeed, it was the first ever PR agency-generated idea to win the big prize in the 15 years that the PR Lions has been running at Cannes. And it topped a very successful year for PR agencies at Cannes overall, especially from the UK, which we'll come on to talk about. Meanwhile, the global Golin business, headquartered in the US and run by a Brit, Matt Neal, has been outperforming much of the sector as well. It saw double-digit organic revenue growth in the second quarter of this year, for example. Like many other big PR agencies, Golin's seen a fair share of changes in the past year or so, not least with major promotions for our guest today. Congratulations. So let's dive into some specific topics here. And I wanted to start with creativity, because I think you guys have been on a bit of a creative journey. And the Cannes win obviously endorses this. And I'm sure there's much experience that you can share with us that other PR professionals and other agencies can really learn from. So could you talk a bit about the creative function at Golin, how it's structured and how this has developed over the last 1 or 2 years?
For sure. And I think at the heart of it all is, I suppose, a mindset, the foundation to everything, which is that we wanted to redefine the kind of role of earned in the kind of creative mix within the agency kind of world, and build everything on that kind of up level, the value of the creative idea, create the idea, not just amplify it, and have the ability to develop and deliver ideas with the best of creative agencies across marketing disciplines. So I think fundamentally there's that ambition or mindset that sits at the heart of it all. And then around that is built the kind of structural stuff around integrating the conceptual and studio teams to bring the kind of creation of concepts closer to the execution and make sure the craft levels are very high. Majoring on integration and how you sweat ideas across different channels and how they connect, and bring that expertise in through hires and through kind of development of staff, and ultimately as well bringing the production function to the core of that too. So you're able to produce and execute multi-channel ideas in the same way as an ad agency might, but always coming back to, I think, that principle that we're an earned agency, that there's a real strength in kind of PR and that mentality of earning attention that we build everything onto, and ultimately sits at the heart of all we do.
I think just to add as well, like when Al and I first started working together, I think we recognised the importance of the business seeing creative as not just the nice bit that sat over here and came up with nice ideas, but was really deeply integrated in terms of being a commercial growth driver for the business. Like we could see that by doing great work, you got more money. I mean, it sounds obvious, but I think sometimes that connectivity isn't there. And I think Al has an incredible relationship with our clients, and you're very commercially minded. He's thinking about that aspect of the business all the time. And I think when you bring those things together, it allows us to develop the business, because commercials being driven by creative and vice versa. So it's a good positioning within the business, and people get that and could understand bringing Al in to that client dynamic.
And how radical was it? Was it a complete rethink of your whole creative function?
It feels like an evolution, really. I mean, 2024 has been a big year, but it's been the kind of product of a multi-year kind of approach. And Ondine and I kind of talked years ago really about that ambition, and over time have kind of pushed towards that. And I think small changes in both, kind of the external facing work that everybody sees, but then internally as well, and bringing more people into that ambition and kind of taking everyone on a journey, and ultimately you end up in a place that we are today. So I think, it's been a road, and I'm kind of excited for what comes next really, because it feels like we're getting into our flow now.
And which single change do you think made the biggest difference in that journey?
I think it's a mindset shift. All of the changes are important, but unless you have the change in mindset, you revert back to old habits. And I think, there's amazing stuff that comes from being a PR agency and having that earned legacy. But at the same time, we need to kind of move beyond that if we're going to push the work. And so, yeah, that was key.
Okay, and is there still work to do, or do you feel like you've got to where you want to get?
Oh, there's always work to do. And I think, Ondine and I have kind of views on this as well, kind of looking at the wider business and how everything plays its part in the journey that we're on.
Yeah.
Creative is not an isolated function. It's at the core of the business, but absolutely connected to everything else.
Yeah, definitely. I think like the landscape's continuing to shift, isn't it? And I think we're doing a big piece of work actually at the moment, looking at kind of how that media influencer social ecosystem is evolving. I think there's going to be some really interesting things that come out of that will allow us to sharpen this even more, like from a data and analytics point of view through to kind of the executional side of it, the kind of formats of the content that we're creating. I think all of that I can see will lead us to perhaps, different kinds of specialist hires, perhaps looking at kind of like the kind of relationship you guys have with data analytics and how we're kind of really kind of continuing to merge that. So I don't think we're done. I think it's just really sharpening it now.
And I guess that's the big change, isn't it? It's the way people, particularly younger consumers, consume their media. It must change everything, right, in terms of how you reach them with your creative messages.
Absolutely. But at the heart of it is still that understanding of how you earn attention, understand how ideas come to life in the real world so they're not just wallpaper in a paid environment. And I think the whole PR industry has that kind of innate strength. And the more you can kind of weaponize that and build on that, I think as a whole, it becomes very exciting. And I think, we're seeing shifts in kind of how ideas come to life and all the rest in culture, but ultimately we're really well positioned, and I think better positioned than a lot of kind of traditional ad agencies and all the rest of it. I mean, I hate the word agile, but we are, by our very nature, our origins have kind of toughened us to needing to earn attention and be fleet of foot and react to culture and all these things that, perfectly place us now.
And is it reasonably unique, do you think, your model? Did you look at any agencies in advertising or PR or whatever and think, I like what they've done? Or did you just try and develop your own unique model?
I think in everything there's inspiration from other places, but it's about taking the best bits and putting it all together into something unique. And I think if you look at the best performing creative agencies, like the Uncommons, the Wieden and Kennedys, like how do you get inspiration from that, but also build on the foundation, which is a great earned PR agency, and extend that into social. And so always pulling elements.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I mean, it's interesting. We were talking about this before. It's like, when you look at the sort of large agency mix, sometimes it can feel there's not a lot to differentiate, in terms of model and structure. And fundamentally, I have a firm belief that the culture is what actually creates the different environment. And I think that's where I do think we're unique. We've put a lot of time and focus on energy on how we create a culture which helps work like this to thrive, helps create the mindset that Al's talking about. And fundamentally, you can have the best plan on a page, you can have the best ideas, you need people to, make it happen. And I think if I had to say what makes us different, that's part of that blend, really.
Yeah. So how does the UK operation work with the global team and creatives in other markets? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of connectivity. We have our global chief creative officer, George Bryant, who kind of shares our vision for the work and where everything's going. And I think as much connection as we can achieve is amazing. Obviously, everybody has their own business going on, but when you get into kind of hero projects like the latest ASICS work that we've been doing, you have the opportunity to gather around ideas in execution, whereas in other things you might actually join in the development phase and actually work collectively with those guys in development sprints and processes, and they'll take and build the idea. But I think what's been interesting is that over the last couple of years, that international spirit of connecting creatives across markets to come up with ideas that spread has really been a kind of central focus. And I think that's paying off.
And George Bryant is based in
UK,
in
London.
the UK.
Yeah.
He's the global creative chief officer, and he's a Brit, of course. And who is the equivalent in the US then that you work with?
Well, George sits at the top of the structure. Then you've got the market kind of CCOs. So we've got Ron Dinacenzo over in the States, and then we've got Shovik Mukherjee in APAC, and then there's myself over in kind of the UK.
Okay. So it very much feels like the UK is a creative powerhouse for Golin.
Yeah, and we've been on a journey to kind of make it a centre of excellence globally, and looking at how we now extend those learnings out to the kind of the global mix of clients, like how the DNA of the ideas, like how we actually got the ideas away or even developed or executed the ideas, like all learnings. And I think that's the thing, sharing that across the borders to kind of help everybody get to a better place.
Let's talk a bit about AI, because we're always talking about AI these days, and how you're using, if you are using AI in your creativity and indeed the rest of the agency.
Yeah.
Can start with
Do you wanna take
creativity.
this one?
I can start. I mean, I think, yes, we are looking at how we integrate it in lots of ways. I think we've been quite careful about how we've gone about it, in that I think this whole piece around finding efficiencies, scale, speed, I think we've talked a lot about, actually it's about improving quality and in all the different guises. I think where we've seen the best impact is on kind of both the data analytics side of things, where I think we've really embedded it into a lot of our reporting systems, and actually that's where we're seeing really interesting results for our clients, where we can do at speed reporting with really interesting insights that are generated and some degree of prediction around stuff as well. So I think that's somewhere we're really seeing the benefit. I think on the creative side, I think it's definitely helped on the production piece, but I'm sure Al will share this. I personally don't think it's there in terms of the conceptual side, or some of the work that we're doing and kind of design aspect from a real conceptual point of view. So there are limitations to it.
For sure. I think, we're talking about AI now. Who knows what AI in a year, 5 years is going to be. But speaking on it right now, I suppose we see its use more in the execution of stuff, in terms of like the design side of things, speeding up the process there, like even from mood boards to kind of conceptual stuff for kind of sets and all the rest. But very little in the conceptual end of it, really coming up with a kind of an insight or a kind of a creative leap. And it still feels at the moment that's the preserve of humans. Don't know how much longer, but that's our kind of mix at the moment. I mean, you can use tools like ChatGPT to sweat an area or a subject kind of for summaries, obviously, and kind of look to mine your own insights a little bit out of that. But we're doing the lifting. It's still a human-led creative effort.
What about sort of geo-targeting your work? Because I think Mars used that in one of their Cannes entries this year. Is that something you've looked at?
In terms of using it to be able to work out placement of kind of different aspects of media,
work out the placement of the audience and therefore tailor the message to.
Yeah, totally. I mean, to be honest with you, it's not a capability we hold in house at the moment, but I absolutely know from an IPG point of view, that's exactly where they're looking at that kind of production, media buying side of it is where it's obviously coming into its own. Definitely.
I think the interesting thing is, as these technologies emerge, it's how you plug them into that earned-led integrated model. How do we use it differently to perhaps the ad world to drive conversation further? I think it's interesting. It's an exciting time. It's literally like living on the set of Terminator 2, right? So
yeah, well, let's hope not. So John Harrington has asked me about your take on the recent spate of trend jacking, Brat Girl Summer, Demure, etc. So I'm not sure I'm an expert on this area, but he asked me to ask whether brands should get involved, and if so, how and when.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the news jacking part of our jobs has always been there. I think the shift around this trend jacking thing is actually now being able to do it at super speed. The trend emerges, it's there before as a brand you can get around it. So I think, yes, we are doing it. We've had some good results, but I think the ability to do it is based on how quickly you can see that trend forming. So the piece around predicting stuff with the use of AI is where things like that, we're really getting interesting abilities to kind of see it forming before it's really there, and then being able to get ahead of it, because the worst thing you want is to be at the tail end of that and showing up and then, you've missed your moment.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting one because we've always, as earned-led agencies, we've always tapped into culture and opportunities to jump onto stuff. But the big question, I guess, is how you do it, and do it with a kind of approach which builds on it and doesn't just echo it in a kind of dad at a disco, kind of very mindful, very demure, kind of, great from a hardware brand. You're kind of like, okay, how are you using that trend as a kind of jumping off point for perhaps a different idea or something? So Ola, the Ola dupe work was great for that, where they saw obviously that kind of trend around cosmetic dupes and they launched their own and took social by storm. But that for me was like, you saw a kind of a trend emerging, you put your own spin on it, and it felt entirely credible for the brand. And it wasn't just joining the queue of everybody else kind of jumping on that.
I wrote an article in the I newspaper recently about a number of brands who are more like older legacy brands, kind of employing the whole Brat Summer thing in a sort of ironic way. So they had older people using Gen Z slang, and it sort of became viral because it was a bit crap, to be honest.
Yeah. Embrace the crapness. I mean, anything stand out. It's interesting to do stuff differently. I guess it's like how you are the first to do it and do it the best.
Yeah, and like you say, you've got to be quick, right?
Definitely. And I do think some of those trends, on the whole, when you look at them, are coming from quite an interesting place from a humour point of view. Like, generally, that's where you kind of see those trends amusing. People are observing something that's a bit absurd or commenting on it. And actually, as we know, the humour piece is big. That was
Huge.
part of the reason why Specs, you kind of tapped into a time point. I think we're all looking for that. So I think that trend thing is probably quite aligned with that as well.
Yeah, I think humour's always been a big part of the PR armoury, hasn't it? Possibly
Definitely.
more so than advertising, because you can move the joke on in PR with earned.
Yeah, and ultimately, like, as a way to cut through, entertainment is really powerful, right? Even if you end up in a very serious place, which is where the misheard version stuff kind of came in. But yeah, to open the door, and I think there's a wider conversation about brands' roles in kind of connecting with people and brands as entertainment creators, and how you kind of step into that in a way that feels really credible and doesn't just feel like you've bought your way into it in quite a clumsy kind of executional approach.
Yeah. So talking of humour brings us nicely on to Cannes, because obviously Cannes had a humour category for the first time this year. I don't know what you thought of that experiment into humour, but with the dust now settled on Cannes, which was back in June, how do you reflect on it now? Was it really a breakthrough year, not just for Golin, but PR generally, or did there just happen to be some good campaigns from PR agencies around?
I think I would love it for it to be a turning point. And I think whether it is or not is entirely dependent on what the industry does next. It's entirely in our hands to go, all right, that's possible. Let's do more of it. How do you do more of it? And ultimately raising the game to repeat it. I'd love to see other agencies take it next year and own that category. But not only that, extend out into others. I mean, like, getting the Audio and Radio Grand Prix was, for us, really special.
That's
because
the same campaign won that.
Same campaign, right. But it's kind of like, that's a traditional ad category. Like, PR agencies don't often step into it. So it's like, we don't just win on home turf. You can also step into different places. Earned-led ideas are powerful and flexible in that kind of regard. And I'd love to see more agencies doing more of it. But yeah, it's we're up for kind of that shift.
Do you think it's changed the thinking in the agency world generally about Cannes, your success?
I mean, we've had a really good reception. We've had lots of conversations with our peers in the industry about, and it's been lovely to have that feeling that the industry has kind of come forward and gone, actually, we can do this. And it's created that platform. I'm very mindful of, like, there's conversations around how accessible it is as an awards platform, and also, the cost associated with entering. And there is a reality to that in terms of actually what's possible. But, you look at what the ad agencies enter compared to what we did, and the scale, like, you can do it in a really targeted, thoughtful way. And so I think that's the piece that feels like it might hold people back. It doesn't feel like to build those case films, to kind of put the weight behind it is challenging. So, we're not at the scale of the ad agencies. So, yeah, it is expensive to make the films to enter. Yeah.
And I suppose that could preclude smaller and mid-sized agencies from doing it. There's no way that you can do that cheaper for agencies who can't afford these big budget.
Well, I think that the cost of creation of all those assets over time has come down. There are ways to get videos, say the case film, etc. Because there's a lot of raw talent out there that's kind of clamoring for opportunities to work. So I think finding the right partners to craft the entries with is really important. Obviously, the entry cost in itself is quite punchy, and it depends how many categories you're going to go after. The ad agencies like bomb the categories for a very limited return often, and sometimes no return. But that's just part of the ethos, and I think it's almost like that. That's the price of playing. But I think, to Ondine's point, you can be very targeted about it, and you can be smart in how you create the entry. But it all comes down to whether you've got that idea at the core, right? And I think, traditionally the ad was sometimes been guilty of creating an amazing entry on an idea which perhaps had some holes in it and may not have even been real. Whereas I think earned ideas inherently have to be real, have to get traction in the real world. So it's like how you then kind of build on that to make them stand out.
And it helps to have a good president of the jury as well, doesn't it? Who gets...
Understands,
absolutely. I mean, Kat, highly respected, seasoned kind of...
this is Kat Thomas from One Green Bean.
Yeah, and you had like Fenella Gray as well from the UK in there too. But like people who really get it and get where kind of PR and Earned is going. And I think that was an important thing. And I hope that the jury in future is structured to reflect that kind of expertise in the category.
Yeah, that's probably enough on Cam. We've got the PRWeek Awards next week anyway, which is a much better award scheme. And I wish you all luck in that and every other agency who has entered that. So tell us a bit about how the consumer and the corporate and other parts of the business are working together these days, because you're not just a consumer brand agency.
No, absolutely. And that's another part, I think, of big evolution of the business over the last 4 years, is really looking at how we not only built those practices, but actually brought them closer together. And we've seen huge success with that. I mean, if you look at Virgo Health as part of the Golin mix, which obviously I ran before taking on the role at Golin, when we look at Specsavers, for example, that is an absolute amalgamation of a specialist healthcare agency with a really strong consumer creative background. And that blending is doing us really well. And that's actually the approach we've taken overall. So our corporate practice, which was relatively small 4 years ago, we were very intentional about the way that we wanted to construct that. And again, blending that into the specialisms versus making it a standalone function has really helped to grow that within the client base that we've had. So that integration is really core across it all. And we try and kind of flex, in terms of where people are working in the business and how they're learning from each other. So yeah, it's a huge part of how the business has evolved.
So is there still a fundamental difference between consumer and corporate? Because I know there's been this message that corpsumer has been a thing in the last few years and that there's breaking down the boundaries, and obviously corporate campaigns and corporate communication should be creative, but is there still fundamental differences between the two?
I think there is. I mean, I think where you've got the blend, there is a blend. And I think, where we work on clients where you're looking at the corporate reputation through a brand lens versus obviously pure play corporate comms, the harder end of that scale of investor relations and corporate reputation and crisis and issues management. I mean, they are skills in their own right that whilst they need to understand the broader brand environment, I think they definitely have a distinct place still. I don't think that there's a blending in every area, definitely.
What would you guess is the percentage of business in Golin London that is corporate, and what percentage is consumer brand work?
It's actually a really different question because of that blending. So actually one of the things that we did quite purposefully is to try and take down the silos by actually removing those singular P&Ls, which I think obviously has been a really, a historical way of operating. We actually took that away. So our corporate practice is not seen as a revenue driver for itself. It is so it's really blended in. So actually when I look at the distinct, just pure play corporate clients that are coming for very specific crisis issues that sit outside that, I'd say it probably makes up about just 20%. But if I looked at the consumer portfolio, which is now, within the Golin practice is about 80% of it, there's probably a huge swathe of that, maybe like 30-40% that sit actually in that kind of blended space.
Interesting. Because there is a narrative in the industry that consumer PR has had a pretty tough time over the last 5, maybe even 10 years, and that the corporate side has actually grown in terms of work and revenue. Is that a problem?
I think it's kind of, again, where you're playing on that consumer space. So I think the level of sophistication of consumer work is up level, whether that's bringing in a corporate lens on things, or whether it's, as Al's talking about, how we're up leveling our creativity, our understanding of like channel planning and execution and insight and measurement. I think the requirement of how are we delivering more sophisticated consumer work as a whole versus it being specific about its corporate.
What have been the biggest changes you've noticed in what your clients are asking for in the last couple of years?
I mean, I think as a whole, like coming back to the point about level of sophistication, I think that the business challenges we're seeing are more complex. There's no doubt about it. And in a good way, we're being brought into some of those conversations. So I think that shift in terms of what they're looking for us to solve for and how we help them to do that has definitely changed. And I think, when you look at kind of measurement and return on investment and asking us to turn up with those kinds of analytics, which I think is a big shift from where we were, which is a good thing, but represents a challenge as well in terms of how we kind of take the internal teams on that journey with us. So definitely a shift there, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, from a creative perspective, I think just a higher expectation, a higher bar, which is great to hold kind of agencies to account. And that's not everywhere, but certainly you're seeing kind of emerge where you're seeing kind of ambitious comms clients, I think, who are working in integrated fashion internally at their end, having that connectivity to marketing and understanding that actually to stand out in culture as media budgets perhaps are shrinking, there's an opportunity. And so how you jump into that and then holding us to provide the answers.
And is that Specsavers is a good example of that, is it?
Specsavers is a great example of that. And I think they're a great organisation for flexing kind of their model to see opportunities in marketing and lean into those. So the earned-led integrated approach really paid off a Misheard version. And then straight there's an appetite about how you can, formalise that and look at kind of the DNA of other campaigns and other processes within the business to kind of lean into the kind of proven power of it. And I think that ability to flex and seek inspiration from places and then convert that into kind of a business process practice is really interesting. And the businesses that manage to do that best will obviously do better.
And does that mean that these sort of clients like Specsavers are putting more money into their PR budgets than they were previously, as opposed to just saying, we can do this. What we used to spend on advertising, we just do it cheaper by putting it. Are they shifting budget into the earned media?
I think you're seeing a lot of evidence of that, and it's not based on goodwill and just blind faith. It's based on evidence, and I think something we've been really kind of hot on is proving that creative effectiveness at a commercial level and side by side saying equivalent spend. Okay. This idea is going to generate far much more return. So how about next campaign, we formalise that? And I think that's what you are seeing with the kind of campaigns that we do with the various brands around the business.
But I think like we were talking about earlier, Al and I were saying, I think maybe there's a perception that we've got these huge budget clients that are willing to put loads of money behind the campaigns that we're doing. And a lot of the work that we've done has come from quite humble beginnings. I think that's the point, is that you're absolutely right. I think, there is probably a direction of travel where marketing are looking at the comms leads going, oh, hang on a second, it feels like you've got something that we need over here now, and are looking to spend more money. But there's definitely a journey of still proving that value. And I think we've, you were saying that we're a couple of clients where we don't have massive budgets, but we've been with them a long time, sort of proving that value, slowly chipping away, getting more of the marketing spend. And, that doesn't mean you have to have massive budgets, I think, to kind of deliver some of the work that we've been doing.
No, you just have to have, I suppose, the ambition, and everything else can follow, because the DNA of the Ideas Now approach remains the same, and it's how you work within the kind of constraints that you have to still push for greatness, I suppose. We're not just reliant on the huge budget, and I think that's when you start putting out some of this bigger work can be a growing misconception. But we love a smaller brand and an ambitious client who wants to stand out and will work with you in really close partnership to make that happen, and not just externally but also within the business. I think that partnership and PR being seen as the kind of partner to walk together internally and sell the value of it is really important, and I think that works for the small as well as the huge.
Of course, you want those budgets to grow over time.
Well, that's I mean, as creative as a growth driver. We will walk that road with you, and we'll get more budgets, and we'll do bigger ideas, and everybody wins. And I think that's the thing, that we look for everybody to win around the table, and that's paid off.
We hear that it's pretty tough out there in consumer PR at the moment. The clients are cautious and they're not willing to push up budgets. Is that you're finding the same?
I think when you look at the kind of incoming briefs, I think that would probably be fair to say. I think, we've really focused on, as Al said, looking at that kind of our current client base and how we grow organically. And I think that's really probably seen us through some pretty tough times, because I think we've got that partnership, and I think that going on that journey when they're going through those tough times, to be really, really strategic about how we're spending their money, showing that return. We've actually had a really successful year. Our organic base has been amazing. I think it's tough on the pitching scene right now, really, really tough. I think it's the toughest it's ever been. And as an agency that's obviously profile-wise in a really good place, it's still a real slog. Not just win pitches, but I think really ascertain what's a genuine opportunity, and also, which clients are really going to partner with you in the way that you want to. Our assessment criteria for pitches has changed really dramatically over the last year, from being budget and good brief to now being like, is this client willing to build a really good relationship with you?
Potential in that client.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
And why do you think clients are being like that? Why are they being so cautious?
we talk about procurement. I do think there's a big influence of that procurement process coming in. Obviously, they are there to negotiate. If money's tight, that's their job. But I think the influence of that on the process means that it becomes quite a process. And, historically, we've always felt like if you're going to go into a pitch, you need to have a time with the client. You need to have built that chemistry. You need to understand you're on the same page. You've got the same ambitions, beyond what budget they've got to spend right this second. And I think the influence of that procurement process, budget focus, driving down and negotiating has kind of eroded some of that aspect to it, which makes it really difficult, I think.
As I understand it, the same thing's happening in the creative advertising world as well. I don't know if that's what you hear, Al, but I used to edit campaign years ago, and I'm still in touch with a lot of creative agencies in the ad world. They're also having a tough time. So it's not just PR.
No.
Whereas media agents, I think, are probably doing better. Do you know why that might be?
There's many points of view on this. I feel that it's an interesting conversation about the role and the proven power of creative to deliver commercial return. And I think sometimes the media agency perhaps better at proving that and converting it to kind of data, saying, yes, marketing director, we have, kind of shifted this many units off the back of that and X, Y, Z and the tracking. Creative side of things has always been to some degree intangible. And I think that has to be respected about it. That's the power, that's the magic. It kind of connects to something that you can't quantify. The kind of progressive clients hold on to that power of that creative that you can't prove, the intangible, and then look at how you build around that rather than take away from it. Because I think taking away from it is the easiest thing to do, but it's the hardest thing to return to. And I think brands perhaps have suffered from that shift over time. No names, but they're out there.
Okay, so let's talk about DEI. Last week, Golin London announced a new DEI plan for the London office. Could you give us a flavour of what that involves, please, and why this is a big focus for Golin?
Sure. So it's not a new focus, it's a new plan, but we've been doing it for quite some time. Fundamentally, the approach to DEI has been that it isn't something that sits off on the side. Like, we've really tried to embed it in every aspect of the business, and we very intentionally went out and hired an expert who was in sort of a sector and field which felt slightly ahead of where historically the PR world had been. And we wanted to bring that kind of rigor to our approach. So it's been a real journey to the plan in itself, and it's embedded across the business, as I say. And I think even the plan was a culmination of a number of different streams of work, which was about setting an ambition and vision around inclusion as a whole and what we wanted that to do, and rooting it really in the business, both from the point of view of like doing the right thing, but also really about fundamentally how it helped to create amazing work and help that to thrive. And that whole piece around integration is bedded in a sense of people being able to come with perspectives and opinions and work collaboratively. And so when we came back to our new office a couple of years ago, that really was at the foundation of it all. It was like DEI is just a way of us being together and working together versus it feeling like something was off on the side. It can sometimes feel a bit disconnected from the whole. So as I say, it's been a journey of a plan to build it. Within it, we have our ambition of inclusion and how we all came together to work out what that looked like in terms of the behaviours we wanted to exhibit in our business. And then there's 4 really key pillars in terms of the work we want to do around recruitment, retention, engagement within the business. And a big focus is obviously measurement, which we focused in on when we were discussing the launch this week.
Yeah, I think it's a particularly powerful point, isn't it, that DEI and cultural improvements need to lead to business growth and need to lead to better work and better creatives. If you can prove that, you're winning the battle, you're winning the war.
For sure, and hopefully we are proving it. I think that for me, that kind of diversity point always ends in like diversity of thought, and so it's more fuel for the fire. If you want to do different work, then you have to have the greatest range of different people to feed into that with perspectives and keep coming at things in a fresh way. And I think the biggest danger that we all kind of face in kind of the marketing agencies is doing ideas which are an echo of the past, right? And doing familiar formats and things like that. And I think we're always trying to push into new or different places, and you need the new perspectives to do that. Otherwise, you are literally becoming a dinosaur.
Can you give an example of that, where having a diversity of thought has helped you create better work or a better campaign?
I think it's present across everything we do to some degree, dialed up and dialed down in different places. I mean, the ASICS weight loss stuff was kind of really interesting for that. There were elements within that campaign which were specific, but I think it's really an overall principle that kind of you go into work as a start point of like bringing everybody's perspectives into that initial kind of searching for insights, building on that, and then how the idea is executed. It's in the fabric of it, rather than saying, oh, this is a distinctly DIA-focused campaign. So
the ASICS weight loss, what was the perspective that you got that you wouldn't have got in a less diverse team that helped you craft a powerful campaign?
I think it's about the conversation around the problem and how that comes to life in terms of how people feel about themselves and where those people are kind of coming from and the experiences they bring. And all of that kind of feeling setting up the need for the brand to take action and actually step into starting to disrupt people searching for Beachbody and quick exercise results, and actually, you know, step in rather than just talk about the problem and go, we're going to actually kind of stand for some change.
So it's planning as much as creativity, really.
Yeah, and I think that whole act of planning is absolutely, I think the creative strategy and planning is at least 50% of the idea. And that's something that we really major heavily on. And I think if you look at any of the headline work, it's always got that at the core, because otherwise you're based on novelty or a kind of randomness, and that can really work, but it's a gamble. And I think if you're going to elevate, you need the foundation to be strong. And I think the traditional creative agencies have always understood that.
Also big planning departments.
For sure.
Rock star planners,
Exactly. But ultimately, I think that point about scale and kind of like huge departments and things like this, I actually like the fact that we're not huge departments. And actually, it's just a really close collaborative group of people who are just very tapped into kind of what's going on in the world. And as I say, trying to bring in different perspectives to kind of keep that pot always boiling. Something always going to come from that's interesting.
And that's not easy. Like, I think that's the thing we've really learned, is that actually, you know, none of this is easy when you're bringing people those different perspectives. It does create tension. Like, we've had lots of kind of difficult, challenging points, but we know that the jumping off point that we've got to creatively has been better for that. Like the weight loss thing is a good example. Like, I think, you know, there were challenging conversations around some of that definitely got us to a better place.
Which you probably needed to have to create a good campaign.
And the tension's super powerful, and ideas that don't have at their core often just feel a bit beige. If you're looking to get a reaction with the work, then tension is super useful from the start.
I think it's a very good point. I want to ask you about the Burger King campaign, which has been a big story over the past week or so. This is the campaign talking about new mothers and whether they want a Burger King meal as their first meal after giving birth or whatever. What was your take, or what side are you on the argument?
I'm not a mother, so I'll defer to Ondine on this.
You're going a new father.
I am, different audience.
It's an interesting one, and actually I think the context around it, as I was saying, I think the US team for Golin launched a campaign called Special Delivery for Grubhub. I think tonally it was a lot softer, and it felt like there was a choice associated with it in terms of like the insight is really, and as a mother myself, is that meal after giving birth is really personal. Like, and everyone has a very personal feeling about what their favourite food is or what they want at that point. And the thing with the Burger King thing was, for me, that it felt forced, i.e. Burger King was the right choice for a mother once they've given birth. So it's a really nuanced slant on it. But there is a difference, I think, between the fact that it's such a personal thing that the burger in there felt quite aggressive.
Yeah. Do you think it'll... Because it's created such a controversy, arguably it gets amplified as a campaign. I mean, do you think it'll have a positive or a negative effect having been amplified to this extent?
I mean, it's got people talking, as you say, and I think that's the point. And so that tension aspect that Al talked about, it's created that. And so that's the intention behind it. So good, or whether we think it's good or bad, it's achieved what it was intended to do.
For sure. I think, you know, it's worse to be ignored than it is to be kind of challenged and be at the centre of a debate. Guys at BBH have done some pretty interesting work in the past about how even supposed bad news still works out really positively for a brand through awareness. And, you know, in the grand scheme of things, people don't care that much. No. So it's like, how are you measuring it? But yeah, it's an interesting one. It'd be interesting to see how it does at the shows. I think, you know, probably very well.
In terms of its effectiveness as a campaign, I wonder. I don't know how they would measure something like that.
Yeah, well, I think that'll be the make or break on it. I mean, it's a great piece of creative. Fundamentally, it is an ad there's no real kind of action behind it. I can see its face value. So it's kind of, add effectiveness. How did it work?
I wonder if we'll see that at Cannes next year. Very
Certainly.
Interesting to find out. Okay, let's move on. So let's finish by talking about the other priorities for the agency in the year ahead, apart from the work and DEI. What else is on your list?
I mean, we've got something that seems to be working quite well. So I don't think we're going to massively deviate from what we're doing, being really honest. But I do think it's about sharpening that further, as we were saying, in terms of the type of specialist potentially we're looking to hire next year. I think the further and deeper integration, understanding that kind of ecosystem from a media point of view and trying to bring even closer kind of the data analytics side of it with our insights, with the creative. I mean, that's still a work in progress. As I say, we're still on that journey, I think, to get to a place where I think our planning processes are so tight that we're able to come up with those ideas at speed, again and again and again. I mean, that's the dream that we're trying to get to.
I think you alluded to hiring in different specialisms. What are the specialist skills that you urgently need to get into Golin over the next year or two?
I think definitely probably scaling up with our influencer offering, that we have a really small, very, very effective influencer team. But I think the briefs we're coming to us now, I think, are looking at kind of how we do more of the influencer work at scale, which is not something we've necessarily had. So I think scaling that and bringing in more of those specialists, I think, will be important. I think it's still a really challenge to find really, really strong social earned people that can integrate into a PR agency. I mean, I think that's always been quite challenging.
Why do you think that is? Different generation?
I think potentially, I do think there's a diversity piece within it in terms of kind of that generational piece, but also potentially I think that the craft at some points have sat alone, and I think asking to come in and kind of connect into the traditional media space and look at it from a bigger picture point of view has sometimes felt quite difficult for those specialists to kind of see that more holistic picture, which is kind of what we're asking, and I think that can kind of sometimes be quite challenging.
You haven't tried sort of buying a social media agency or an influencer agency? I think your sister agency, Weber Shandwick, has done that from time to time, hasn't it? Bought in specialisms.
Yeah.
Is that
I mean, I think it's always something on the horizon, on the radar. I know that, IPG and Golin are always looking at potential acquisitions. It's just that sort of tip and bounce of what you can build internally and bringing it in. Acquisitions are hard to do, and they don't always work. So there's a big outlay for something that often doesn't go quite right.
And you've often got the integration problem as well, right? Because if you're buying something in culturally, it's much more difficult to integrate it with your your team.
Yeah, for sure. Two mindsets collide sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, so very finally, predictions for the agency and the industry in the next year or so. Obviously, we're nearly at the end of this year. Is 2024, 2025 going to be better? Is it going to be easier? Is it going to be harder? And what's on the horizon, do you think, of the big new challenges coming up?
Coming at it from an employment perspective, obviously it'd be really interesting to see the legislation that Labour are going to bring in potentially around employment rights and things like that, which obviously connect with the campaign we've just run. But I think from a real business point of view, I think that could be quite interesting in terms of how we have to shift around some of those things. I mean, I think fortunately, as an industry, we're probably a bit ahead. I think we're quite mindful of kind of the mental health aspects of work and the generation that we're kind of having to support through their careers. But I do think that will be interesting in terms of actually having to see the disconnect from work and how we're going to manage.
Switch off stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a real challenge for us in the world that we're living in. And whilst I think we've done well to, on a whole, find work-life balance. I mean, if there was legislation to come in that was saying that, I think that would be really difficult for us. So yeah, I think.
Do we feel they will say that employees have to switch off at 6 or 7 o'clock, or is it going to be a guidance thing? I think that
to some degree it's going to have to be, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, so I think those kind of changes potentially, I think, have potential to impact our workforce and impact the way we work.
And anything on the client side, do you think is going to be an opportunity or challenging over the next year?
Yes, I think we'll see a continuation of that shift towards more integrated work where the different agencies around the table have kind of more of a steer over kind of what happens. And it's not just that traditional top-down, heavy paid, traditional agency-led stuff. And I think that is a really exciting thing, especially as budgets and things become tightened and other priorities shift around. It's like, what other opportunities does that create? And I think as an industry, Earn can be perfectly placed for that.
And is it definitely happening? Because as long as I've been in and around PRWeek, which is a couple of decades now, there's always been this, death of advertising, future is PR and earned. Is there any evidence that...
Yeah, I don't think it is going to be the death of advertising, but it's a subtle shift. And, nothing happens overnight, but the world changes. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing as an evolution. And it opens up interesting possibilities.
I mean, there's also the view that obviously the advertising agencies are catching on to it too. So
Totally.
I think that might be interesting next year. We're hearing on the grapevine of ad agencies bringing PR people in, or, looking at how they might want to sort of merge and things like that. I think that could be interesting because I think they're going to think, how are we going to keep up? So I think we're going to have to accelerate as well. Like, we're going to have to keep going because I think that they've got the budgets, they've got the scale, they can probably pivot if they need to. So that, I think next year could be interesting in that respect.
Yeah. And of course, you're part of a group, Interpublic Group, which has ad agencies. Does that insulate you to that threat a bit?
I mean, look, we partner with lots of IATs. Like, we work on some of our big clients with partners within the advertising world. And I think they increasingly value more than ever, I think, our partnership on that basis. Yeah. They're also wising up to the fact that they can see some of their budgets perhaps being siphoned off. So I know they are thinking, like, how do we perhaps bring some of that into our own four walls? Yeah. And I think that could well happen.
Yeah, we've got McCann in your group, and Mullen-Lowe, of course, good agency.
We could start to see our people being poached by advertising agencies, which would be interesting because the amount they pay and all of that could really change the dynamic on things.
Yeah, if indeed they can afford to pay more.
Well, now, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and that's all we have time for, unfortunately. Thanks so much to Ondine and Al for your great insights and for telling us more about the amazing journey you've been on at Golin. If you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access PRWeek's Beyond the Noise podcast. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.